Hey dudes, welcome to Splat from the Past, the only 80s themed horror and sci-fi show where things can get totally radical. Now today, I will be doing a tribute to the late great Will Rogers, and I will be interviewing a historian who wrote a book about him in the 90s, Ben Yagoda. Ben Yagoda wrote a book called Will Rogers, a Biography. He did a lot of extensive research. I guess he talked to a lot of his friends and family and chronicled his life. Will Rogers, of course, was a vaudevillian and a radio performer and did silent movies and all that stuff. And he was also one of the earliest comedians of stand-up. And I just think he gets very underlooked in short shrift today. And so I wanted to do a tribute to him because he is legendary. He's got that classic line, "I never met a man I didn't like." You know, I want to find out the origins of that line. And it's going to be pretty cool. So yeah, here is my interview with Ben Yagoda.
Hello?
Hey Ben, welcome to the show, sir.
Oh, thanks. Is this Tommy?
Yes, it is.
How are you?
I'm okay. This is such a great honor. Thank you for taking the time today.
Okay, sure. You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Yes. So you've been a professor of journalism at the University of Delaware for a long time. You've written many books. How did you first become interested in Will Rogers?
Well, let me just give a slight correction, which is that I, a couple of years ago, retired from teaching, so I'm not doing that at the moment. But yeah, I was at the University of Delaware for many years. So this back in the late 80s, I had been a freelance writer. I had worked for newspapers, magazines, and I was really itching to write a book, and decided that as a magazine writer, the kind of article I enjoyed the most was profiles of people, and then it would make sense to look into doing a biography as a kind of long profile. And also, part of the appeal of that was that I was a little worried about structuring a book, being such a long piece of writing, and that a biography had the natural structure of a person's life in it. So I was looking around for biography subjects for a period of, I guess well over a year, maybe close to 2 years, and just trying to find somebody who was interesting to me, who hadn't been done, or at least not done recently, or done recently and well, and who I could interest the publisher in, not a totally obscure figure. Yeah. And I don't remember, so I went through, probably dozens and dozens of names, and all didn't work. A couple of them fit all the categories, but then it turned out somebody was working on a biography of that person. That happened to me with this writer named Ben Hecht, just as I sort of said, yeah, this is perfect. I found out that a book was coming out about him. So I don't remember anytime any name would pop in my head, I would look into the person as biography subject. I don't remember how Will Rogers popped in. I really didn't have any sense of him other than sort of vaguely rope twirling and in the movies, and they would sometimes send around, cans for donations to something to do with Will Rogers, but I didn't know anything about him. Started looking into him a bit, and the more I learned, the more interested I was. I wrote to a guy who had done a sort of scholarly book on Will Rogers and said, what do you think? Is it due for biography? He said definitely. There had been one back in 1960, I think it was, that really wasn't very good. Aside from, this being the late 80s, it was already 30 years later. And so I went out to Claymore, Oklahoma, which is near his birthplace and site of the Will Rogers Memorial, which is the library and museum that has most of the stuff related to him, and started looking into the files there and just found that there was a lot of material that hadn't been used before. And the thing that really sealed the deal was it wasn't very well organized, which is one of the reasons I think that other writers hadn't been there. There were these loose leaf binders and, letters from famous people or something. And in this binder were the actual letters that people like Helen Keller and Charlie Chaplin. And this one letter from Charles Lindbergh, who turned out was a friend of Will Rogers, and Will Rogers being an early proponent of aviation, and not to give away the spoiler, but he died prematurely in a plane crash in 1935 in Alaska.
Right.
This letter from Lindbergh in the 20s or early 30s and said, I'm glad to see you're flying, just, keep out of single-engine planes at night. And in fact, he died in a single-engine plane. I don't think it was at night, but this was such a chilling thing. I said, this has got to be my next project or my first book project. And sure enough, I went back and got together my material and wrote a proposal for this book and got a couple of offers and chose the best one, and then I was off.
Wow. And how long did it take for you to write that?
Such a long time ago, I'm going to say the whole process took from that, initial trip to the research and the writing to finishing, the editing, probably about 3 years, maybe a little bit less, but about 3 years.
Amazing. Wow. Yeah, I first became aware of him around 1987. There was an HBO documentary called Will Rogers, A Look Back in Laughter. And it was where Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd, Rodney Dangerfield, Harold Ramis, and Robin Williams were all introducing different sections of his life during the whole hour. And I thought it was very interesting.
I think I remember that for sure.
Yeah, it used to be on YouTube too. It's not. I don't think it is anymore though, because I was looking for it and stuff. But did you get to know his friends and family during the research?
I did. I got to interview. I really feel very lucky. His son, who is known as Will Rogers Jr., and kind of followed. He had three children, two sons and a daughter, and Will Rogers was such a multifaceted person that kind of interestingly, each of the kids followed one aspect of him. So Will Rogers Jr. was a writer and was an actor for a while and kind of an intellectual. Mm-hmm. So I got to interview him and his son, Will Rogers' son Jim. Will Rogers, of course, was a horseman and rope spinner and started out as a cowboy, and he became a rancher, kind of a down-to-earth guy. I got a chance to interview him. Unfortunately, his daughter, Mary, who had followed him into acting and was in, I think, at least one Broadway show and a couple of movies, died not long before I started the book, so I didn't get to interview her. But and there weren't that many people who had known him. So this was the late 80s, and he died in 1935, so that would have been, over 50 years earlier. Yeah. So I can remember the people I interviewed who knew him. One was the comedian Maury Amsterdam, who was on a bill with him in vaudeville in the 30s and remembered him well. Another was the actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who's in a movie with him. I got a chance to talk to, I think it was two women who were in the Ziegfeld Follies, who were Follies girls back in the early 20s with him. And then a guy who was a cowboy who worked on, Will Rogers had a ranch out in his home in California, sort of a modified mini ranch, and this guy, Ray Bell, had worked with him there. Oh, and then a guy who, named J.J. Cohn, C-O-H-N, who had worked for the Goldwyn, Sam Goldwyn's silent film company, which had Will Rogers under contract back in the very early 20s, and they would room together when they went on location, and in fact, one slept in the same bed at some remote place in Mexico or near Mexico, and maybe one or two others. So it was a limited number of people who knew him, but it was definitely great to be able to talk to those who I could.
Yeah. So, getting more in depth into his life, he was the youngest of 8 children. Were they poor growing up?
No, he was not poor. He grew up. I think he was born 1879, if I remember correctly. Now,
Yes.
You're not going to hold me to my exact truthfulness and everything I say, because this is a long time ago. So
Yeah.
I'm giving my best recollection. So it's certainly sincere. But I do remember 1879, and he was born in what's now Oklahoma, then Indian Territory. And his mother and father were both roughly 1/4 Cherokee, and were counted, as Cherokee. And Will Rogers, that was, a really important part of his identity as he was growing up, and his career and everything, his Cherokee background. But his father was a well-to-do rancher, Clem Rogers. He had cattle and land, and Will worked on the land as a cowboy. He sort of bristled, as a lot of when you said 8 children, that sounds a bit high. I know he had a couple of siblings who didn't live, but I think of him as having 3 sisters and himself, if I'm remembering correctly. But he was the only boy, except for one who died young, and he kind of bristled with his father. His father was sort of a gruff guy and never would approve of anything that Will did. They called him Willie. I mentioned he didn't graduate from high school. He didn't do well in school. He loved being with the horses and the cowboys, and he left the ranch and went out working as a cowboy in other situations. And finally, this was around the time, late 1890s, when the land, the wide open spaces were closing up, and he sought wide open spaces in Argentina. He went down to work as a cowboy in the Pampas there, and worked there for a while. Stop me if I'm saying something that's not of interest or superfluous, but it relates to how he started in show business. Ended up getting a job in South Africa, so went from from Argentina to South Africa, and ended up there just sort of by chance getting involved with the Wild West show. He had skills partly, coming from necessity, spinning ropes and lassoing cattle and horses, and practiced it a lot just for fun, as people did at that time, and then got a job doing that as a specialty in this Wild West show in South Africa. So that was the start of his show business career.
Yeah, did he always have that plan of getting into show business since he was a little kid?
Not at all. Nope. I don't think he mentioned it, in his reminiscences or letters that I was able to see from those early years. Yeah, he didn't kind of know what he did. He loved horses. He was a wise guy and a class clown, as a lot of comedians were. But I definitely don't think that he had any idea that he would do what he was going to do. I mean, he was there were these Wild West shows that would come through at the time when he was a kid back in Indian Territory. And I think he got to know some of the people involved in them. So that probably planted the idea. But it wasn't until he joined that show in South Africa that he really, had the idea that he could do that for a job.
Yeah. Do you know if he was influenced by Mark Twain at all? Because to me, he picked up where Twain left off.
It is a natural comparison, but I have to say, and as I was doing the book, I'm a huge Mark Twain fan, and the answer basically is no. I mean, he was aware of Mark Twain. He wasn't a big reader, except for the newspapers, which he devoured. He wasn't a literature reader. Great writer, not a great reader. And I think the sort of thought I had that I expressed in the book was that he was less a kind of follower of Mark Twain's writing than a kind of real life Mark Twain character.
Yeah.
He had a little of the quality of a Huckleberry Finn to him, and kind of put that sort of innocent act on a la Huck Finn. But he did not. He was not a follower of Mark Twain in a conscious way.
Okay. You mentioned before about how he dropped out of school and stuff. Yeah, he once said he studied the fourth reader for 10 years.
That's right. And as I recall, that is one of the rare Will Rogers quotes that he really said. It's an amazing phenomenon nowadays if you look up on the internet Will Rogers quotes.
Yeah.
And the things that pop up, 95% are fake. Mm-hmm. It's people have the idea that any sort of thing that sounds homespun and witty will just say, well, Roger said, I don't know how this happens. And, the same thing happens to like Winston Churchill and Mark Twain and some of these other people who are known, who, did say things of a certain quality. Anything else of that quality gets attributed to them. So I'll warn your listeners about that. And I mentioned the Will Rogers Memorial, and that's still an ongoing institution out in Claymore, Oklahoma, which I really recommend.
Nice.
Anybody visiting when and if people start traveling again.
Yeah.
And they've got a website. I don't know the address, but if you just Google Will Rogers Memorial, Claremore, Caremore, you'll find it. And they've got a guaranteed solid list of Will Rogers quotes, the things he really said. So if you're in doubt about anything, you could check it against their list.
Nice. Yeah, he was in the Army. Do you know if he was a good soldier?
He was not in the Army, unless I'm totally forgetting something. No, he was definitely not in the Army. His father was in the Confederate Army in the Civil War, oddly enough, or maybe not oddly enough, interestingly enough. But Will Rogers was not in the Army.
Okay, that was just a misprint from Wikipedia then. He's got a great story, though, about how he pretty much got discovered. Something that he was at Madison Square Garden and a steer got loose, right?
Right, that is true, yeah. So he found his way back home from South Africa and then got involved with this American Wild West show. Tommy, I'm looking at Wikipedia now, and I see that there's a line that said, it is often claimed he took a job breaking in horses for the British Army.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Before war had ended 3 months earlier. So that's interesting. That is not even Wikipedia acknowledges. So he went back home to the U.S. and wanted to continue working in using his job skills as a roper and rider and stuff like that. Worked in the a Wild West show in the St. Louis World's Fair, and then got involved with this Wild West show, which was a pretty popular genre then. That Buffalo Bill had started it, and he's real famous. And they would have casts of dozens and dozens and dozens of hundreds of cowboys and Indians, and putting on battles and all sorts of stuff. And interestingly, as a Indian Native American, that he played a cowboy against the Indians was an interesting irony. So he was working at this show in Madison Square Garden, and sure enough, a steer got loose and into the seats, and he roped it. And this got a lot of publicity and led to him thinking, hey, I like this. I like New York. I like being the center of attention. And this was the heyday of the form of entertainment called vaudeville, which is basically variety shows that would be around the country, and there would be 10 to 15 acts. There would be a singer and a comedian and a juggler and a strongman and people who did things like roping. and he actually so he went on the vaudeville stage, and his act included himself, his rope, and a horse, and an assistant that he traveled from city to city doing his rope tricks with an actual horse. I often wish that there was vaudeville maybe happen a little bit later, so that there'd be film of and with sound of some of these acts, which just a lot of them sound amazing. But eventually, he became a big success in vaudeville. And he started that in 1904.
1904. Wow. So who were some of his contemporaries in vaudeville, like Charlie Chaplin, Stan Laurel, Marx Brothers?
I think he might have interacted with the Marx Brothers. Charlie Chaplin was not in vaudeville. He did interact with Buster Keaton and his family's act. Buster Keaton's father and mother had this sort of acrobatic comedy act, and Buster, as a little kid, I think he got nicknamed Buster because he got his head busted so much they would throw him around and more or less know not to injure him, but he really knocked about quite a bit. And Will Rogers became friends with Buster Keaton's parents, and later Buster. One of his best friends in vaudeville, later with the Ziegfeld Follies, which was kind of a glorified vaudeville, was Eddie Cantor, the comedian and singer. He worked with W.C. Fields, Sophie Tucker, the black comedian and singer Burt Williams. He was in vaudeville for a good 10 years, so he really kind of got to know everybody who was in it at the time.
Mm-hmm. The Ziegfeld Follies, that ran for 40 years. It was pretty long.
I'm not sure about for 40. And his association with Ziegfeld was this man, Florenz Ziegfeld, who was a major impresario. Started out doing a show called the Midnight Frolic, which was in a roof garden in the city, and hired Will Rogers. Now, the important thing to say about Will Rogers, I think 1915 or so at this point, was he started out, his act started out as roping horses and jumping in and out of his rope and stuff like that. He found out that he would make these offhand remarks often when a trick failed, and people would start laughing. And over time, his act became less roping and more talking. And by the time he got with the Ziegfeld Frolic and then the Follies, it was, he'd have the rope, no horse, and it was almost like, if you remember Henny Youngman, he used to come on with a violin sometimes and tell 10 jokes, then do a little ditty on the violin. It was like that. He would tell 10 jokes and do a little rope trick and 10 more jokes. So he became from a guy who was strictly a roper to a roper who sometimes told jokes to a joke teller who sometimes roped. And the Ziegfeld Follies he was in, and the sort of heyday of the Ziegfeld Follies was the late teens and early 20s. I think it might have run on in different forms beyond that, but that was really the heyday. And he was in the Follies for a good bit of that era, from the late teens through the early to mid 20s, and that would tour around the country, and really did a lot to cement his national reputation, because it was a really big deal. It was sort of more elevated and more recognition and fancier and slicker, and a million girls and the best talents of both acting and writing, choreographing, costuming of the day. It was a big deal to be in the Ziegfeld Follies.
Yeah, just like you just said, he was one of the first comedians who had a gimmick, and his was the rope. That set the stage for, Henny Youngman with the violin, as you said. Jackie Vernon with the slideshow. In the 80s and 90s, there was a guy named Glenn Super who came up on stage with a megaphone. It was
Right.
He was like the earliest one of
yeah, interesting. That's just a good point.
Of that, yeah, to do that, to have that gimmick. As a lot of people know, he wasn't very popular with his political beliefs in that era, especially growing up in the South, and that he was a Democrat. What were his beliefs really?
Well, it's a good question. It's a hard question to answer. He was, we're talking about, his real career as an entertainer starting in, 1904 or so and on to his death in 1935. And he was a popular entertainer. And, I think of that quote from Michael Jordan, what was it, Republicans buy sneakers too,
Yeah.
And so he did not want to offend anyone needlessly. On the other hand, his talking, unlike a lot of those other comedians we've been mentioning, it wasn't just sort of like mother-in-law jokes or the equivalent of mother-in-law jokes at the time. It was mostly political and based on the news. I mean, if you remember another comedian, Mort Saul,
Yeah.
you're probably too young to remember Mort Saul.
No, I know Mort.
He would come on with a newspaper. Well, where did he get that from? Will Rogers. Will Rogers came on stage with a copy of the newspaper, and actually that started in the Midnight Frolic days, because in the New York Midnight Frolic, he would be in the same venue for weeks on end, and the same people would come in, so he couldn't do his same act. And desperate to, make it different, he said, well, what changes every day? The news. So he brought up the newspaper, and his most famous quote was, or actually two most famous quotes. One of them was, all I know is just what I read in the newspapers. And he would say that and then comment on the events of the day. His other famous quote was, I never met a man I didn't like.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he became a topical commentator, and, he was a Democrat. He was a big supporter of FDR when FDR came to the fore. He was, a populist. He generally held what we would call now progressive views, but he wasn't. He knew that he, didn't want to offend anyone or lose part of his audience. So he made sure, and I don't think it was fake. He kidded everybody. He like when Johnny Carson would do his monologue, he would kid the Republicans and Democrats alike. Not like today when we have a president who is so, horrific that it's impossible to be even-handed in your kidding. I guess I don't watch too much late-night comedy, but apparently it's kind of all Trump all the time.
Yeah.
Will Rogers was equal opportunity kidder. But his heart was with Democrats, and he actually spoke, if I'm remembering correctly, and introduced Roosevelt at the Democratic Convention in 1932. But yeah, he was more or less a liberal Democrat, but kidded everybody.
Yeah. I did stand up in San Francisco for 10 years, and I used to see Mort Saul around. I never talked to him because he was a curmudgeon, but yeah, he had that line. He said, "I never met a man I didn't like until I met Will Rogers."
Well, now that you say that, that rings a bell that somebody so Mort Saul never met Will Rogers.
Of course.
So if you said that, it was, I guess, I don't know, a cheap shot or something, or just a off-the-cuff thing. But I think there was a guy, a writer who's now kind of forgotten, named, if I'm remembering correctly, H. Allen Smith, who was sort of in the 40s, maybe into the 50s, a fairly well-known humorous writer. And he actually wrote, my 3 years of research remembering correctly, the only thing I ever came upon of someone speaking poorly of Will Rogers was this H. Allen Smith article about running into him at a rodeo, and I think he claimed that Rogers was rude or gruff, or and I think he said that line that you quoted, or some version of it.
I wouldn't doubt it. Comedians can be all those things.
Yep.
But I remember in that documentary, though, that I mentioned before, I remember Dan Aykroyd said that there was a period where Will Rogers completely lost everything, and then he regained everything, and it was all because he talked just like he did the first time around.
Well, yeah, I think what he might have been referring to was, going back to our story, he was in the Midnight Frolic and the Follies, and then he got involved in silent pictures, and was hired by the Samuel Goldwyn's company, and started making, this was back, 1918 was his first film, and that was when movies were still produced in New York, the New York area. This was actually in New Jersey, and so he did the Follies and the movies, and around that time, early 20s, he started his syndicated newspaper column as well, which was huge eventually. But then Goldwyn and the pictures moved out to California and lured him out there. And by this time, he had a family, his wife and his 3 kids, and they really took to it. They loved California. First they were in Beverly Hills, and then ended up in a place. So you're out there now, Tom? Is that right?
I left San Francisco 3 years ago. I've been in Redding, California.
Okay. So, yeah, his place in Pacific Palisades, sort of his ranch, where he played polo and had a lot of horses, is now a state park, and I really recommend visiting it. It's a beautiful place, and the home is kept just as it was when he lived there. His films with Goldwyn were quite successful, and
Silent, right?
Silent films, yep, exactly. Yeah. A number of these are still available. He did one called Doubling for Romeo. That was quite a good one. A lot are no longer, don't exist anymore. But he did one called The Roping Fool that was about, a thinly veiled version of himself who loved to rope horses. And, there was a girl and a hokey story, but amazing. And I think The Roping Fool is on YouTube, if I remember correctly. It was an early use of slow motion photography, so that you could see the roping in slow motion. It's really pretty cool. So he was successful with Goldwyn, and then at a certain point, he decided he wanted to be his own boss.
Right.
And I guess a lot of people in Hollywood over the years have decided that. And the details are not fresh in my mind, but eventually it was a failed venture. It was not successful, and I think that must have been what Aykroyd was referring to. He sunk a lot of money into it. I mean, he by no means was broke, because he had his he had his newspaper column, which was in 400 newspapers around the country. It was the first column that the New York Times ran, this assigned column by a writer every day in the New York Times, and then it did a weekly column. He was very successful on the lecture tour, charged a lot of money, went around the country giving talks, kind of a version of his lengthy version of his vaudeville stage. Eventually, he would have a very successful radio show, one of the first, radio shows. But I think what Aykroyd would have been referring to is the failure of this silent film company, and then movie stars talking, and the Fox company, later 20th Century Fox, signed up Will Rogers and to make talking pictures, because of course the idea of Will Rogers in a silent film is almost like having a ventriloquist on the radio. It's like, well, why would you do that? But so the talking pictures were right in his sweet spot, and he was hugely successful. He made about 2 to 3 or 4 films a year from 1929 till his death in 1935.
Yeah,
and so yeah, and that I think what must have been what Aykroyd was referring to.
Yeah, and Will Rogers, he was on the radio.
Yeah, he had a radio show, and he would just sit there and talk, starting in the early 30s, and it was hugely successful. It was, always one of the top 5 shows in ratings with, Amos and Andy and a couple of others. And, he I don't even know, he certainly didn't write out a script. He just got up there and talked. He probably had a couple of notes. And his famous gimmick, talking about gimmicks, was that it was, an hour-long show. He put an alarm clock in front of him, and he set it to go off in an hour. Mm-hmm. And when the alarm bell rang, he said, "Okay, that's our show for today. See you next week." And that was the show. So you could do that in your podcast, I'm sure.
Yeah. And I do sometimes. He was... when he died in 1935, I compared that to the equivalent of the Challenger in 1986, and that ice was the problem. Yeah,
that seems to be the case. So, yeah, he was always wanting to fly, looking for new adventures, and looking for topics for fodder for his column, basically. And he went up to on a trip with this aviator, Wiley Post, and the idea was to go from Alaska over to Russia. And he had been to Russia once before and wrote a book about his travels as well as and I forgot to mention he wrote a number of very successful books. So he basically did every medium. But yeah, they had landed in Point Barrow, way up near the North Pole. And when they took off, I guess the engine iced up and it failed and crashed. And your comparison to the Challenger is apt, because it was just a national shock. This guy, I didn't, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I didn't know much about him, but I learned that at the time of his death in the early 30s, I made the statement that I think he was the most popular individual in the country, and maybe this second most famous after the president. He was beloved. Cities and rural areas, and this was such a shock. I learned about that from reading about the reaction, and then I started to figure out, well, why is he somewhat forgotten? I didn't know much about him. I would throw out his name to friends and acquaintances, and unless they were people like my father who remembered Will Rogers, they say, yeah, it's the guy with the rope. What is it? And I finally figured out that, well, his humor was very much of its time, and what he did was very much of its time.
Yeah.
But things changed so quickly. 1935, think of it, the Depression had hit, but, and he did some of his best commentary about the Depression, really, and went on relief tours and really did a lot of hard-hitting commentary. But that happened, and then all of a sudden the war happened, and all of a sudden it was a new era. It was the era of the Will Rogers just seemed so far in the past. And then the other thing that happened was just when I was a kid, you'd turn on TV and you'd see the Marx Brothers, and you'd see W.C. Fields, and you'd see the Three Stooges, Laurel and Hardy, but you would never see Will Rogers. And it was just, I think, his sound movies didn't age very somehow Fox never sold the rights, and so his films were never on TV, strangely. And so he was just kind of forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, God, look at all the contemporaries that he had that went on to have their movies successfully shown on TV and stuff.
Yep.
I mean, it's just or reran at the theaters. I mean, that's just crazy.
It is, but I'll say again that his movies generally didn't age very well. So when you compared to like on Marx Brothers or W.C. Fields, which have a little bit more zing to them. His movies are really quite corny for the most part. There are a couple of good ones. Like he did a few movies with John Ford, the great director.
Oh yeah.
Including Judge Priest, which a lot of people think is his best film. His last film, Steamboat Around the Bend, was with John Ford as well. And then he had one that was a rather sharp satire that I thought was pretty good called Dr. Bull. But a lot of them are real period pieces and just haven't aged very well.
Yeah. And his son played him in a movie about his life. Did you do any research on that?
I did. As I said, I interviewed his son. I'm not really sure if I saw the biopic. I kind of felt like that wasn't that important to me as I was writing about Will Rogers' life, and let me do my own research. And this movie was, from the 50s. So, looking back, I probably should have seen it, but I don't think I did.
Yeah. I imagine when he died, he was still pretty prosperous and on top of his game.
Totally. Yeah, he was at the top. I mean, he just had it all going. The movies, the radio show, the column. I think his wife was a wonderful woman who wrote her own book, Betty Blake Rogers. I think in her book she says, and I don't think this was, hindsight or application or anything like that, that he was talking about slowing down. I mean, he would have been, he was coming on 56 years old, perfect health and railroad and everything, but I think he had driven himself, really hard for a lot of years, and I think was sort of preparing to wind it back down a little bit. Interestingly, I think he had one film that was in the works, hadn't started filming yet, where he was going to be teamed with Fox's other, they had two great popular talents. Do you know who the other one was?
No.
Shirley Temple.
Oh.
So they were going to team up. And in fact, there was some I don't know if I had it in my book or not. Do you have a copy of the book?
No.
If not, I'll get your address and send you a copy.
Thank you.
When we're not sure, I might have a picture in there. But yeah, there was a publicity photo in the studio of Rogers and Shirley Temple, and they were planning to do a picture together.
Wow, that's crazy. Do you know if that movie eventually got made with somebody else?
When you said that, it rang a faint bell, but I don't remember. I think it might have, but I'm not really sure.
Okay. Do you have a favorite Will Rogers quote, even if it's not really his own?
Yes. No. I don't go for any of the fake ones, but my favorite real Rogers quote is. You had a good one. What did you quote earlier on?
Oh, the one about the.
The 10 years with the fourth grade reader or something like that.
Fourth grader, yeah.
That was good. Well, I get two. One was my ancestors didn't come over on the Mayflower, but we met them. We met the boat.
Yeah.
That was a good one. And the other one was, I don't belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat.
Oh, yeah, I like that one. My favorites are make crime pay, become a lawyer,
Okay, Tommy. All right. I don't think that's real.
Yeah.
That really doesn't sound real. I'm pretty sure that's not, but it's good anyway.
How about never miss a good chance to shut up? He said
That
that.
sounds more like the real thing. I'm going to look those up and check it out because that's like a little hobby of mine, tracking down these Will Rogers quotes.
Yeah. Do you still talk to his remaining family members?
No, I don't.
I imagine you must have gotten good feedback with the book from them.
Yeah, both Bill, his Bill and Jim were very nice about it. But no, he has some pretty distant relatives who I'm not in touch with. I'm in touch with the former director of Will Rogers Memorial, who's a great guy. But no, the people who knew and had any close connection with Rogers are really they're not around anymore. He had might have been a second cousin, once removed or something like that, who was a Western actor named Clu Gallagher.
Oh yeah.
And I saw a reference to a child of Clu Gallagher. I forget whether I was in touch with this person or just a reference, but that was the closest connection I've seen in recent years to Will Rogers.
He actually pronounces it Gallagher.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever heard it. I've only seen it, so thanks for that correction.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I like a lot of the horror movies he's been in.
Okay.
Last year, Will Rogers was honored with a Google Doodle. Did you hear anything about that?
Oh, right. And with a rope? Was there a rope involved?
I believe there was.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, would that have been his anniversary? No. I guess they just thought of it. A nice thought.
Yeah. He pioneered comedy in a way that no one had before him, and that since Lenny Bruce, Shelley Berman, George Carlin came after him, I mean, what do you think he would have done if he had lived another 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, I I spent a good amount of time thinking about that. Like, how would he have reacted to, World War II and the atom bomb, the Holocaust? And frankly, Tommy, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I just don't know. I'm sure he would have reacted to it. I'm sure he would have engaged in those things because that's what he did. He engaged in what was going on at the time. Mm-hmm. But what he would have said, I confess that I couldn't hazard a prediction. I don't know. I would have been really interested to see it, but I just don't know.
I think that if he had lived a little bit longer, he would have been a huge TV star.
Yeah, right. He would have been a little, so in the late 40s, he would have been like around late 60s, early 70s. And he definitely had it in him, absolutely, to master that medium. Whether he would have wanted to keep on going that long, I don't know, but he would have conquered that medium. I agree with you. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah, he could have had a Western sitcom, almost
right.
Almost like
a Walter Brennan type. I'm thinking more just like, talking.
F Troop type.
But,
yeah,
an early talk show.
Yeah, like Honeymooners, I Love Lucy type of sitcom.
Right.
But then again, he wouldn't have became so legendary like he did from his death in 1935.
Yeah. Part of the Will Rogers thing is that he lived in that different era, and if he lived on into the 50s, he would have had a different legacy. He would have been, more famous, and I probably wouldn't have written the book. Someone else would have come along, multiple people earlier on, but he would have been more a part of our world than he kind of is, for sure.
Mm-hmm. So during this time of COVID, are you working on a new book?
Yeah, I'm working on a project, actually two projects involving another writer who's O. Henry, who was the great short story writer. And I'm putting together a new edition of his work for a great series called The Library of America that should be out, I hope, in maybe early 2022 or late 21. And then I'm also working on a book of my own about O. Henry, who had an interesting life that I won't go into in detail, but he was from North Carolina, spent a lot of time in Texas, was in jail for 3 years for embezzlement, and ended up in New York City in 1902 and lived there from 1902 to 1910. And a good number of his stories, maybe the majority, are set in New York. He really took to the city. He was a great observer of New York. It was a time, well, Will Rogers was there in vaudeville, and like a lot of amazing things and changes were happening in New York City at the time, and O. Henry observed and wrote about a number of them. So I'm working on a book about his years in New York City.
Nice.
But in a way, it brings me back to at least a part of the Will Rogers story.
Nice. Do you think it'll be out next year?
No. I'm in the early stages of it, so the
Could be 2 years.
anthology of stories will be out either next year or the year after this one, and probably a year or two after that.
That's awesome. Well, Ben, I thank you so much for coming on today, and I hope that book turns out successful for you. And yes, I will send you my address.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for the questions. It's always a pleasure to talk about Will Rogers, and I appreciate your interest.
Yes, I think he's very underrated these days, and people should be aware of him being one of the main forefathers of comedy. And I thank you for your awesome insight. And stay safe and have a great day.
Okay, thanks a lot. See ya.
Okay, bye. Well, there you have it. Ben Yagoda. Ain't he a cool dude? Wow, he's got a lot of knowledge for Will Rogers. And even stuff that he forgot. I mean, he remembered an awful lot, and that was pretty cool. And that was cool that we got to reflect on one of the pioneers and forefathers of modern comedy. If you like this video, everyone, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, add me as a friend on Facebook, join my Tommy Kovac comedian page on Facebook, follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and all that fun stuff. Well, that's all the time we have this week on Splat from the Past. Until next time, this is Tommy Throwback Kovac saying, there's no shame in living in the past, because the present sucks. Later, dudes.